The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 miles. That is the entire gap between the Persian Gulf and the open ocean, the only maritime corridor through which roughly 17 million barrels of crude oil pass every single day. At this moment, somewhere in those waters, a vessel is moving under military escort. Its crew is communicating in code. Its cargo, several 100,000 barrels of oil bound for Asian refineries, is being treated not as a commercial shipment, but as a geopolitical asset. And somewhere on the Iranian coastline, a battery of Noor anti-ship missiles is tracking its position in real time. This is not a hypothetical. This is what the Strait looks like today. But what happened in the last 72 hours is something different from the constant background tension that analysts have managed and modeled for decades. Something crossed a threshold. Not a minor provocation. Not another drone incident in the Red Sea that makes the evening news and fades by morning. What Iran did, and what it chose to do publicly, with attribution, with what intelligence sources are describing as deliberate signaling, is the kind of decision that does not get made at the level of a regional commander. This was authorized from the top, and the geopolitical architecture of the last 40 years was not built for this moment. Here is what the mainstream coverage has not fully explained. The action Iran took did not just threaten a ship or a military asset. It struck at the legal and commercial infrastructure that underpins how 30% of the world's traded goods are insured and routed. The Lloyd's of London market has already flagged the entire Persian Gulf corridor for emergency reassessment. When underwriters move, everything moves. And they moved within hours. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why Iran chose this specific action and what it reveals about its strategic calculation right now. Why the economic consequences are already cascading through oil markets, shipping insurance, and food supply chains in ways that have not yet reached your newsfeed, and what the three scenarios are that analysts are genuinely debating, including the one that no government is willing to name publicly. Stay with me. To understand what just happened, you have to go back to October 7th, 2023. That date did not just change the immediate calculus in Gaza. It reordered the entire threat architecture of the Middle East in ways that are still working their way through the system. Iran's leadership looked at what happened in the weeks and months that followed. The American carrier strike groups repositioned in the Eastern Mediterranean, the pressure campaigns on Hezbollah's financing networks, the quiet but persistent Israeli operations targeting Iranian proxy infrastructure from Syria to Iraq, and drew a specific conclusion. The conclusion was this: the window for managed, deniable escalation was closing. The strategy of advancing Iranian interests through proxies while maintaining plausible distance from the consequences was becoming harder to execute and increasingly costly to sustain. Through 2024, Iran's response was calibrated but unprecedented. In April of that year, Iran launched a direct strike on Israeli territory for the first time in its history. Over 300 drones and ballistic missiles, the majority of which were intercepted by a coalition that included the United States, the United Kingdom, Jordan, and Israel's own Arrow 3 system. The strike caused limited physical damage, but that is not what mattered. What mattered is that Iran had crossed a line it had never crossed before, direct acknowledged attribution for a strike on another sovereign state's territory. The response to that April strike set the parameters for everything that followed. Israel struck back, carefully, proportionally, targeting radar systems at an Iranian airbase rather than nuclear infrastructure or command and control. The message was calibrated. We can reach you, but we choose not to escalate. Iran received that message, and then spent the next several months recalculating. By early 2025, the economic pressure on Iran was intensifying. The reimposition of sanctions under successive American administrations had compressed Iran's oil revenues significantly. Inflation inside Iran was running at rates that social scientists describe as destabilizing. The rial had lost the majority of its purchasing power over a 5-year period. The Islamic Republic was managing a domestic political environment that was increasingly restive, with the memory of the 2022 protests still alive in the institutional memory of the security services. In that context, Iran's leadership faced a decision that states in this position always face: whether to capitulate to external pressure, which is politically and ideologically impossible, or to demonstrate to its own population and to its adversaries that it retains the capacity and the will to impose costs. The April 2024 strike was one version of that demonstration. What happened in the last 72 hours is another version, but at a categorically different order of magnitude. And the difference matters enormously. Let us now examine precisely what Iran did and why the military community is treating it as a significant doctrinal shift rather than an escalation of familiar patterns. What Iran struck was not a military installation. It was not a warship. It was a civilian maritime infrastructure node, specifically a very large crude carrier, a tanker class that carries between 2 million and 3 million barrels of oil, transiting international waters under the flag of a treaty ally nation. The weapon system involved was, according to initial assessments, a Khalij-Fars variant anti-ship ballistic missile, a system with a range of approximately 300 kilometers and a maneuvering warhead specifically designed to defeat close-in naval defense systems. Here is something that no maritime strategist had fully modeled in modern contingency planning. Iran used a ballistic missile against a civilian vessel in peacetime international waters. Anti-ship cruise missiles have been used in this region before. The Houthi campaign in the Red Sea demonstrated that. But a ballistic missile, with the flight profile and the warhead mass that this class of system carries against a non-combatant vessel, crosses a threshold in the laws of armed conflict and in the precedent of maritime security that the international community has not faced since the Second World War. The Khalij-Fars and its successor variants are derived from the Fateh 110 family of short-range ballistic missiles. They carry a guidance package in the terminal phase that uses active radar or electro-optical seekers to home in on the heat and radar signature of a large vessel. The warhead is assessed at approximately 600 kilograms. To put that in context, the warhead on a standard Exocet anti-ship cruise missile, the weapon that struck HMS Sheffield in the Falklands War, is approximately 165 kilograms. Iran just used a weapon carrying nearly 4 times that destructive potential against a commercial ship. Military strategists are focused on 2 specific implications. The first is what this reveals about Iran's willingness to accept escalation risk. The use of a ballistic missile, rather than a cruise missile or a drone, is not a tactical choice. It is a political signal. Ballistic missiles are harder to deny. Their flight profiles are tracked by space-based sensors within seconds of launch. Attribution is essentially immediate. Iran did not want deniability. Iran wanted the action to be known and to be attributed. The second implication is what it reveals about Iran's assessment of its own deterrent capability. The decision to use this system against a civilian vessel in international waters only makes sense if Iran believes that the cost of retaliation is manageable, or that the benefit of demonstrating resolve outweighs the cost of whatever response comes next. That is a calculation that suggests Iran's leadership believes it has more leverage than its adversaries currently credit. What are the options on the table now? The United States Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, maintains a constant presence in the region, currently including at least 1 guided missile destroyer with SM-3 interceptor capability and multiple Arleigh Burke-class ships equipped with the Aegis combat system. Israel has its own long-range strike capability. The F-35 Ayadir, which can range the entirety of Iranian territory, and the Jericho ballistic missile system with sufficient reach to threaten every major Iranian military installation. But here is what military planners are wrestling with tonight. None of those capabilities change the fact that Iran just demonstrated it can, and will, strike a civilian ship in international waters with a weapon that the current defensive posture cannot guarantee to intercept at 100% reliability. And that one sentence is worth sitting with. Here is what the mainstream media is not telling you about the economic implications of the last 72 hours. The immediate market reaction was visible and quantifiable. Brent crude, which had been trading at approximately $78 per barrel in the days before the strike, moved to $89 within 6 hours of the initial reports being confirmed. That is a 14% intraday movement in the world's benchmark energy price, a move that typically takes weeks of supply-side news to generate. The options market immediately began pricing in scenarios above $120, with some desk analysts at major commodity trading houses privately discussing $150 as a plausible tail risk if the strait is effectively closed for even 72 hours. Let me put this in concrete terms. The Strait of Hormuz is not just an oil corridor. It is the jugular vein of the global energy economy. 17 million barrels pass through it daily. That is approximately 17% of all the oil consumed on Earth. Saudi Arabia exports the majority of its production through these waters. Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, all of them are effectively landlocked from a maritime energy perspective without the strait. Iran knows this. Iran has always known this, and Iran has spent decades developing the military capability to threaten closure, not because it would ever actually close the strait. Doing so would hurt Iran as much as anyone, but because the credible threat of closure is itself a form of leverage. The transmission mechanism from this military event to your economy runs through 3 channels. The first is direct energy price impact. Every dollar increase in Brent crude translates, with a lag of approximately 4 to 6 weeks, into a 2 to 3 cent increase in average gasoline prices in the United States. A $15 sustained increase, which is now inside the range of market expectation, translates to 30 to 45 cents per gallon at the pump. In Europe, where fuel taxation compresses the relative impact, but where energy dependency is structurally higher, the effect on household energy bills is faster moving and more severe. The second channel is shipping insurance. This is the one the headlines are missing. Lloyd's of London and the Joint War Committee have already moved the Persian Gulf and the Northern Arabian Sea to their highest risk classification, What that means in practice is that every commercial vessel transiting the region is now facing war risk insurance premiums that are 3 to 5 times their baseline level. Those premiums are not absorbed by shipping companies. They are passed through to cargo owners, and from cargo owners to importers, and from importers to consumers. The shipping cost of a standard 20-foot container of consumer goods from Asia to Europe, which had normalized to approximately $2,000 after the post-pandemic spike, is already moving upward. Every $100 increase in container shipping costs eventually manifests as a fraction of a percent of inflation in the importing economy. This sounds small. Multiply it across everything that moves on a container ship: electronics, pharmaceuticals, clothing, automotive parts, and it is not small at all. The third channel is food and fertilizer. Qatar produces approximately 30% of global liquefied natural gas. Natural gas is the primary feedstock for ammonia, and ammonia is the primary input for nitrogen fertilizer. Approximately 50% of the world's food production depends on synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. If LNG tankers stop moving through the strait, even for days rather than weeks, the fertilizer market reacts first, then the agricultural commodity market, then the retail food price. The gap between a missile strike in the Persian Gulf and the price of bread in Lagos or Jakarta or Cairo is not abstract. It is a supply chain with known nodes and known timelines. Now consider the reserve day counts. Japan has approximately 90 days of strategic oil reserves and purchases approximately 90% of its energy needs from the Middle East, with approximately 80% of that transiting the strait. South Korea holds approximately 96 days of reserves but operates refineries calibrated for Gulf crude grades that cannot simply be substituted from other sources on short notice. India holds approximately 23 to 25 days of strategic reserves, and its import dependency on Gulf crude is increasing, not decreasing. China holds the largest strategic reserve of any importing nation, estimated at between 90 and 120 days depending on the methodology, but its Shandong independent refineries are disproportionately dependent on Iranian crude supplied under discount arrangements that bypass formal sanctions tracking. If that supply is disrupted, the substitution cost is significant. If you want to understand how this hits your economy before the mainstream media catches up, make sure you are subscribed, because what comes next in this cascade has not yet reached the front page. This is not abstract economics. This is a direct line from a missile strike in the Strait of Hormuz to the price of fuel in your city, the cost of shipping in your supply chain, and the price of food in your grocery store. And the timeline is weeks, not months. Let us now examine who is talking to whom, and more importantly, who is not. The United States has, in the last 48 hours, moved diplomatic communications through 3 channels simultaneously. The first is the formal statement from the State Department, measured, condemning, focused on the illegality of the strike under international maritime law and calling for immediate restraint. The second is a back-channel communication through the Swiss embassy in Tehran, which has served as the de facto U.S.-Iran diplomatic conduit since the severing of direct relations in 1980. The third is a direct call between senior American national security officials and their counterparts in Riyadh, Doha, and Abu Dhabi, not to discuss retaliation, but to assess how much space exists for a managed de-escalation before the Gulf states feel compelled to take independent action. Iran's public position is exactly what you would expect, a combination of justification, defiance, and an implicit offer. The justification is that the vessel in question was engaged in sanctions evasion activity and was operating under flags of convenience to obscure its true cargo destination. The defiance is the language of Iranian hardliners who are positioning the strike as evidence of Iran's sovereign capacity to enforce its security interests. The implicit offer, and this is the part that serious diplomats are reading, is the absence of any follow-on strikes in the hours after the initial action. That restraint is itself a message. Iran is not trying to start a war tonight. Iran is trying to change the negotiating parameters. China's position is the most consequential wild card on the board. Beijing has approximately $80 billion of investment committed in Iran under the 25-year Comprehensive Cooperation Agreement signed in 2021. It is also Iran's largest trading partner and the primary buyer of Iranian oil. China does not want an Iranian-American escalation that disrupts the Gulf Energy Corridor any more than the United States does, perhaps less, given the reserve calculations above. Beijing's foreign ministry has issued a statement calling for dialogue and restraint. More importantly, Beijing has opened a quiet channel to Tehran directly. What China is privately saying to Iranian leadership is the key variable that no Western intelligence service has complete visibility on. What we can assess is that China's leverage over Iran is significant and is being deployed. Oman has historically served as the back-channel intermediary between Washington and Tehran. It was Omani facilitation that enabled the preliminary negotiations that eventually led to the 2015 JCPOA. Oman's foreign minister flew to Tehran 24 hours before this strike, a movement that was noted at the time, but not fully understood. Whether that visit was intended to prevent the action that followed, or whether it was a preparatory contact for the diplomatic aftermath, is a question that analysts are actively debating. Oman's participation in any de-escalation pathway is the most structurally reliable of the mediator options. Qatar's position is geometrically interesting. Qatar hosts the largest American military installation in the Middle East, Al Udeid Air Base, home to the forward headquarters of U.S. Central Command. Qatar also maintains the closest working relationship with Hamas of any Gulf state and has hosted Gaza ceasefire mediation. Qatar has simultaneously dependent relationships on both sides of this confrontation that give it influence and vulnerability in equal measure. Its domestic security depends on American protection. Its regional influence depends on its ability to maintain channels that Washington finds useful. That dual dependency is precisely what makes Qatari mediation credible. What each party needs to be able to tell its domestic audience is where the gap between public positions and private incentives is most visible. Iran's leadership needs to demonstrate resolve without triggering a military response that the Islamic Republic cannot survive economically. The United States needs to demonstrate that the rules of maritime law are not negotiable, without committing to a military engagement that its public does not support and its Gulf partners have not formally requested. The Gulf states need the crisis managed without becoming its primary theater. And China needs the conversation to involve Beijing as an indispensable party, not because it wants the crisis, but because a crisis it helps resolve is a crisis that advances its strategic position relative to American influence in the region. Analysts are currently working through exactly 3 scenarios. Let me walk you through each one. The first is negotiated resolution. This is possible, but requires a specific convergence of conditions that does not currently exist. For a negotiated off-ramp to work, Iran needs to be offered something it can present domestically as a win. Not capitulation, not an apology, but some form of acknowledgement that its security interests are legitimate and will be addressed through a diplomatic channel. For the United States, that means accepting a framework that involves some form of sanctions relief, or at minimum, a commitment to ongoing dialogue. A politically difficult position in the current domestic environment. The most likely pathway runs through a JCPOA adjacent structure, reanimated with Chinese and European participation, that offers Iran a timeline back toward normalized energy exports in exchange for a verified rollback of its most advanced enrichment activities. The strike makes this harder in the short term. It may paradoxically make it more necessary. Both sides understand that the alternative to a deal is a trajectory that neither can control. That is the logic that has produced diplomatic agreements in the past. But the preconditions are not in place today. The second scenario is continued attrition. This is the scenario that does not have a crisis resolution point. It simply continues. Iran periodically threatens or strikes commercial shipping. The global insurance market prices in a permanent Persian Gulf risk premium. Oil stays in the $85 to $100 range as a structural floor rather than a spike. The cost of this sustained elevated environment, week by week, is measurable. Every week that Brent trades $15 above its pre-crisis level costs the global economy approximately $14 billion in additional energy expenditure, a transfer of wealth from consuming nations to producing states and commodity speculators. Over a 12-week period, that is approximately $170 billion. Inflation in energy importing economies rises. Central banks face renewed pressure. The political cost of that pressure falls on incumbent governments in Europe, Asia, and the United States. Iran's leadership is not immune to the calculation that sustained attrition has costs on both sides, but it has demonstrated, across decades, a higher tolerance for economic pain than its adversaries. The third scenario is catastrophic escalation. This is the scenario that keeps strategic analysts awake at night. The trigger that transforms the current situation from a managed crisis into a systemic one is not another Iranian missile strike. The trigger is an Israeli unilateral decision to strike Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Here is the pathway. Iran's strike on civilian shipping creates political pressure inside Israel to demonstrate that there are consequences to Iranian aggression. The Israeli military has contingency plans, specifically targeting the Fordo enrichment facility near Qom, the Natanz centrifuge halls, and the Arak heavy water reactor. An Israeli strike of this nature would not destroy Iran's nuclear program. These facilities are hardened, dispersed, and partially underground. But it would kill Iranian scientists and military personnel and create a domestic political imperative inside Iran to respond in a way that goes beyond maritime harassment. The response Iran's hardline faction would advocate is simultaneous activation of every proxy network it controls. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iraqi militias, Houthi forces in Yemen, in a coordinated multi-front campaign designed to overwhelm the defensive architecture that protected Israel in April 2024. That is not a scenario with a clear off-ramp. That is a scenario that pulls the United States into direct military engagement in defense of Israel, that puts American personnel at Al Udeid and across the Gulf at immediate risk, and that closes the Strait of Hormuz for a period that the global economy cannot absorb. The threshold for this scenario begins with a single decision in Jerusalem that Washington cannot control. That threshold has not been crossed, but it is visible from where we stand. Let me bring this home, because the events of the last 72 hours are not a foreign policy story happening somewhere far away on a map you will never visit. Watch the fuel gauge on your car. Watch the monthly energy bill in your apartment. Watch the price of your weekly grocery shop. Watch the interest rate on the mortgage or the loan that your central bank will now have to reconsider, given the renewed inflationary pressure this crisis is injecting into the global commodity system. Watch the pension fund or the savings account that holds assets in economies, Japan, South Korea, India, that are directly, immediately, and quantifiably exposed to whatever happens in those 21 miles of open water in the next 7 days. This is a direct line from a missile launched from an Iranian coastal battery to the cost of heating your home this winter. From a tanker struck in the Strait of Hormuz to the price of a loaf of bread in cities from Cairo to Jakarta to Karachi. From an insurance underwriter in London updating a risk matrix to the shipping cost of the consumer electronics sitting on a retail shelf near you, the world that existed before that missile was launched is not coming back. The insurance market will not unprice this event. The precedent will not be unset. Zoom out for a moment. What we are witnessing is the collision of three forces that have been building simultaneously for a decade. The first is the structural decline of the deterrence architecture built after the Gulf Wars, a system in which American military presence in the region was sufficient to make the costs of major Iranian escalation prohibitive. That architecture did not collapse overnight. It has been eroding through 1,000 decisions, from troop drawdowns to the shifting of American strategic attention toward the Indo-Pacific, and Iran has been testing its load-bearing capacity for years. The second force is Iran's domestic politics. The pressure of economic isolation, demographic change, and generational exhaustion with the Islamic Republic's governance model, which creates incentives for the security establishment to demonstrate external resolve precisely when internal legitimacy is most contested. The third is the transformation of global energy geopolitics, the rise of Chinese purchasing power, the fracturing of the Western sanctions consensus, the growing ability of sanctioned producers to route oil through alternative financial and logistical channels. Those three forces arriving at the same historical moment is what produces the situation we are now in. Here is the question that this video cannot answer, the question that no analyst, no diplomat, and no government official can answer tonight with any confidence. In the next 48 to 72 hours, Israel will make a decision about whether and how to respond. That decision will be made by a cabinet that is itself fractured, operating under domestic political pressure that is unlike anything it has faced in its history, and advised by military planners who have a detailed operational picture, but no certainty about how Iran would react to any specific response option. The question is whether that decision, made in Jerusalem by people you did not elect and whose names may not be familiar to you, will determine whether the world navigates this crisis through managed diplomacy or walks with its eyes open and its options narrowing toward a conflict that no model has successfully priced. We do not know the answer. That is not a failure of analysis. That is the honest condition of the situation. And that uncertainty is itself the most important thing to carry with you from this video. If this video helped you understand what is actually happening, not the headlines, not the noise, but the full picture, share it with someone who needs to see it.